We're going to continue in this series, 5-part series. This is part 4. We got 2 videos left where I'm attempting to respond to a public friendly critique and review of the work we do on the BEMA Podcast, and all the links that you will need will be in the description of this video. And we're 4 parts in, so we've already done 3 videos, and I feel like over the course of those 3 videos, I started to drift a little bit from my starting point. So I need to take a deep breath, and I need to kind of resettle in this video, because in the very first video I said we just affirmed so much of what Dr. Laura Robinson was saying. We are on the same team. She was very gracious. I loved it when she said we're on the same team, we're fighting the same battle, we both have a love for history, all those kinds of things. And part of what I wanted to say in that first video is that there is nothing wrong with where Dr. Robinson is coming from. What her stance, what she's saying is well supported. It has academic veracity. Like lots of people would agree with where she's coming from. And then over the last 3 videos, I keep wanting to make the point of, but it's not the only voice at the academic table, right? There is another voice, there is another camp, and it's not fringe, and it's not even all that small. I do believe it's a smaller camp than what I would call majority camp. Dr. Laura Robinson represents that larger majority opinion. She's in good company. I'm not throwing any shade at. What I'm trying to do is to say I felt like we were saying there's no place for this other, and there is. There is a school of scholarship. There are people that say this is what happened historically. She disagrees, but there's not unanimous consent about that. There are people that put the history together differently that are also academically respected, peer-reviewed. So it can be an oversimplification. Part of what I think I heard Dr. Robinson saying, and she's right. She's right. And part of it is the nature of what we're doing, and we've built this body of work, and people are on a journey, and they've been listening to us for 140 episodes. So there are some things we start to take for granted. But I think part of what I heard was her frustration was we over-narrate, or the small world problem, we make a conclusion, we just state something as fact, when in her mind it's not fact. In fact, it's not even true. At the very least, we don't, when we presented it, we just presented it like, well, yeah, this is just, all historians know this. And that's not the case at all. A lot of historians disagree with this. A lot of historians don't see it that way. Some historians do. They happen to be the historians that we agree with. But I think part of the frustration that part of the critique she's making is that you can't just say this is the way that it was, because we don't know that. I receive that. That is, we over-narrate. We probably make the small world fallacy. We probably commit that fallacy all the time. Those are healthy critiques. I would turn the same critique around and offer it back the other direction, which is the critics of this scholarly camp like to just say, oh, so-and-so wrote a book about that, and that ended the debate. Well, we looked at that, we decided that was all wrong, and who's the we? Who is the we that decided that camp was all wrong? I mean, that's how peer review works. And so when they get peer reviewed, when people go back and forth, somebody writes one thing, Nahum Sarna, who is a scholar from that camp decades ago, he writes something, and then somebody from the marginal Jesus camp writes something in response that says, that's not right, here's why he's wrong. Okay, you've got 2 camps that disagree, but that doesn't mean that this other opinion ceases to exist. So I think that's just not true. To say, we looked at the Artemis, right? Could be that we're over-narrating. That's absolutely possible. Absolutely. But to say that it didn't happen, and again, we're engaging in the maximalist, minimalist debate, right? The maximalist is going to say we have enough pieces to put together a picture of what was taking place. And there's danger in that because you can put together a flawed picture. Totally acknowledge that. I'm from a maximalist perspective. I believe that when you have enough pieces that you can start to draw a picture that's at least semi-accurate. I believe that's a logical, respectable, academic thing to do. There's a minimalist camp that is the majority that says you can't do that. You can have this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece. You're not allowed to tie them together, right? And so she acknowledges in her conversation about Artemis, we have this shred of information, this shred of information, this shred, and in her minimalist perspective, you can't pull those together, therefore it didn't happen. It's just as dangerous to say it didn't happen. At least I would say this. It's just as dangerous to say it didn't happen as it is when we say it did happen. And I will admit there is a danger to the maximalist approach that says we have these pieces and therefore this is what happened historically. There's a danger there, 100%. And she's right to hold us accountable to that. She's right. But on the flip side, there's just as much of a danger to say we have all these pieces, but it didn't happen that way. Either conclusion, somewhere the two camps kind of meet in the middle and we look at the pieces that are on the table and one group says, I think we can pull them together like this, and one group says, I'm uncomfortable doing that. That's a more accurate representation rather than to say, this is what happened in history, which is what she perceives us doing, and her saying, it didn't happen that way in history, which is what we perceive her doing. So it's that beautiful process of meeting in the middle. So I wanted to pause before we even got into this video's discussion and just remind ourselves, A, we are on the same team. B, the stuff that she's saying is completely respectable, comes from a majority opinion scholarly camp. And all we're trying to do is say, let's not overcorrect. That's the whole beauty of how the academic process works. I don't come on some of these issues, I don't come from the same place that she does. I'm not unaware of the case that she makes. When I look at the information, I land over here and she lands over there. That's okay. Both for her and for us. I'm not saying that in a defensive way. I'm saying I respect where she's coming from, and the process is how we get better and how we make sure we're not getting lazy. Like honestly, since this post came out a year ago, I've been a better teacher because her simply posting this on the internet publicly, it's exactly as it should be. It was the right kind of check. It's the checks and balances, the social checks and balances. It was the right kind of peer check that said, hey, I think you may be taking some things for granted. It's just good. It's healthy. It's healthy. So that's what I want to say. All right. This video, we were going to look at the, let's see here. We called it it'd be the third. So she had an introduction and she had 3 examples and then a conclusion. And so this is the third example. And she is going to talk about, particularly L. Grover Fricks did a series in season 8 and then followed up in season 9. She did a series she called Talmudic Matthew. And unfortunately, this is one of the episodes. Dr. Robinson listened to, she said, about 10 different episodes. And one of the episodes she picked was a very recent episode, which happened to be L. Grover Fricks's Talmudic Matthew series, which happens to be, unfortunately, one of Dr. Robinson's pet peeves, I think, from what I've looked at and what I've picked up and read some other posts that had nothing to do with BEMA and all kinds of stuff. I understand the frustration. And so she said, here's the BEMA podcast. They're using the Talmud to to interpret the New Testament. You can't do that because the New Testament is here and the Talmud is later, and you can't use a later text, which obviously makes all kinds of sense. But I wanted to respond to some of the things that she was saying in that third part of her third example. She called what we were doing at one point a, quote, uncritical use of historical sources. What she means by that is you're using a historical source without thinking critically or critically analyzing its relevance. So the New Testament is written, whatever, late first century. Really liberal scholars are going to say sometimes early second, but let's give liberal scholarship all the leeway here. The Talmud doesn't come in for decades, if not a century after, like a long, long time after. And some of the sources much later than that, right? She's saying you can't use a source from 3rd century as to gain insight on a source from the 1st century. You're going the wrong direction, right? So that's what she means by an uncritical use of historical sources. And we never wanted to suggest, I don't think we do. We never suggest or insinuate an uncritical use of anything. And anybody that's listened to BEMA knows that. We're always telling us to think critically. We're always telling our listeners that we get things wrong. We never advocate for an uncritical use. And we had, in the very first episode of that series, and again, Dr. Robinson may not have listened to that episode. She may have listened to another episode. In fact, I think it's evident that she did. In the very first episode of that series, we have a very direct disclaimer on this very point because we agree with Dr. Laura Robinson on this. You can't just use an uncritical approach, an uncritical use of historical sources. The other extreme, by the way, is just as ridiculous in my mind. The idea that, well, because this is a 3rd century document, that it's completely irrelevant, that you can't use it at all, that it has no bearing on the conversation, seems just as ridiculous. And again, that's going to be a difference in approach from minimalist scholarship to maximalist scholarship. The Talmud's going to talk about, say, here's the example that's going to keep coming back. Hillel and Shammai. The Talmud talks about Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were rabbis that predated Jesus by at least 40 years. So Hillel and Shammai, if they were rabbis that existed 40 years before Jesus, and if they were having conversations before Jesus, those conversations, historically, thinking critically, would be relevant to the conversations of the Gospels. Here's the problem. We don't have them written down until the 3rd century. Can we trust them? Can we trust the 3rd century, that the 3rd century source reflects a 300-year-old conversation? The minimalist camp says you can't. We don't know if Hillel and Shammai were even real people. We don't know if those conversations were really happening 40 years before Jesus. They might be making up those conversations and placing them in that time period, but we don't know if they actually happened. Therefore, you can't use, and that's the difference between minimalist, I can't prove it, therefore I can't use it, and maximalist, which is going to say, I'm going to trust the source material. If the source material says that it happened then, not uncritically, I'm not going to uncritically trust anything. But if the Talmud says that Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel said this, I'm going to generally trust that conversation reflects with some level of historical veracity. How much? That's the game we play. But minimalist, maximalist, right? But we never wanted to advocate, and I don't believe we do, that you should just read Talmud and believe that it gives us insight to the Gospels. It'd be crazy. It'd be historically crazy. But to say that there's no insight from the Talmud for the Gospels, when the Talmud talks about conversations that, in its words, predate the Gospels, I think we'd be foolish not to give that some thought. She even critiques one of our favorite authors and one of our favorite scholars, Lois Tverberg. We quote her books all the time. Sitting at the Feet of Rabbi Jesus, Walking in the Dust of Rabbi Jesus, Reading the Bible with Rabbi Jesus. She's got some great books. We love Lois. We recommend her all the time. She actually did a separate blog post critiquing Lois, and it wasn't nearly as kind as the post she made about the BEMA podcast. She really went after Lois and said, here's all the things that are wrong with Lois Tverberg. Well, in the comments to that post, I will put a link to that post in the description of this video as well. In the comments to that post, Lois responds to her. And I will say that the original post by Dr. Laura Robinson wasn't nearly as generous, maybe even as kind. It was very critical. And I will say that Lois's response was it met her tone. I'll put it that way. But Lois posts a response, a very academic response, and a critique to Dr. Robinson's critique. So you can read that in the comments there, and you can see that. Of the same issue. That's why it's relevant here. She says, all we have are the written sources. And all we have are secondary sources. And we just mentioned that a moment ago. Are these truly secondary sources? Again, what does that mean? That means the Talmud, we don't have a source from Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. We have a secondary source. We have a source written later about what they said. So you have Hillel, Shammai, then you have Jesus, and then later you have the Talmud. And the Talmud says that there were these two guys back here talking, and the Talmud's telling us about what was going on back here. That's a secondary source. Those are secondary sources. Can we trust, and the maximalist says, if there's good reason and good evidence to trust it, yes, we can trust those secondary sources. The minimalist says, I can't trust that. I cannot trust that this conversation was happening back here. And I think it would be foolish to just assume that there's no flaws with the secondary source, but I also think it's foolish to assume that there's no credibility to those ideas either. One of the things she makes is because, so again, we have this idea of Hillel, Shammai. I'm just going to use that as an example because our listeners are used to that. Hillel, Shammai, Jesus, Talmud. In relation to this timeline, Dr. Laura Robinson says there's no good reason to believe that Matthew here would have known anything about Talmud. Which I'm going to agree. There's no good reason to think that. It's later in the historical timeline. So there's no good reason to think that Matthew would know about something that's not going to happen for another century and a half. Totally agree with you. Except when there's obviously it's obvious that there's a connection. And that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes there's like no connection. Sometimes there's an undeniable connection between what's written in Matthew and the Talmud. And then there's a whole bunch in the middle. And the stuff that's in the middle is where that's real dangerous. Here's the kicker for me between the minimalist maximalist debate. When there's an undeniable connection, you have to do one of two things. I mean, there are connections that are absolutely undeniable. So you either have to assume that the secondary source truly is depicting a mainstream Judaism that predated Jesus. So you have to at least acknowledge that there's some historical credibility to what's happening here. Or your only other option, when there's a clear conversation, because there are moments where it's undeniable there's a conversation between Matthew. Either Matthew knew about what the Talmud tells us about, or the Talmud is being influenced by Matthew. And I would imagine that a scholar like Dr. Laura Robinson or another minimalist, I would assume they're going to be super uncomfortable saying that Talmud was influenced by the Gospels and Jesus. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. I do know there's actually a professor right now in Jerusalem at Jerusalem University, JUC, and one of the things that he's lecturing on at the moment is how he does believe that that's how it worked. He believes Talmud was influenced by the Gospels. He actually believes all of it. He believes that Matthew is aware of the stuff that the Talmud talks about. He believes that the Talmud, as a secondary source, is talking about sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it's talking about stuff that predates Jesus. And he believes that there's a conversation between not Matthew and the Talmud and that, but what the Talmud told us about. There's a conversation happening here. And then he also believes that the gospel conversation impacts the Talmud later. That's a bold stance. It's one that I haven't taken. But you have to do something with that. When there's a clear conversation taking place, an undeniable one, and it's not a long list, but there are certainly instances where the Talmud and the Gospels are clearly talking about the same thing. Something is influencing the other. So there's either a predating conversation that influenced the Gospels that the Talmud talks about later, not because it's talking about the Gospel, but because it's talking about a Judaism back here, or this has influenced this. You're going to have to do one or the other. And that's usually avoided in these conversations. And this is why when I look at these conversations, I say, we're never going to advocate for an uncritical acceptance of a secondary source. There's no way, that'd be craziness. But a complete rejection of the relevance of a secondary source is wild to me. And this doesn't just happen with the Talmud. It also happens in the minimalist camp these days. It didn't used to. But in the last 30 to 40 years, it has become in vogue to reject church history as a source. Church history has become secondary source. I'm not talking about church tradition. I'm talking about church history. There's a difference between church tradition and church history. We used to have what we called church historians, people like Eusebius, right? These would be church historians. And now the minimalist camp has decided that that's a secondary, historically speaking, a secondary source. There's too much bias and agenda driving the history. Therefore, you can't use it as a historical source. I think there's wisdom in acknowledging the fact that it's nuanced and you need to think about it critically. I think it's crazy to just completely reject it. But I got to catch myself. I just said I think it's crazy. But I probably shouldn't say that. It seems crazy to me, but there are plenty of scholars that have decided that is the way we're going to approach it. Dr. Laura Robinson's not crazy. I don't mean to say she's crazy. She stands in a spot, and there's a lot of company in her camp. To me, it feels like a decision that I don't agree with. Some of those things. So, that's all I meant to say. In episode 394, L. Grover Fricks uses the Talmud to explain. I'm not sure that we ever meant to imply that the Talmud is the source for explanation. I think the whole time in the series we seem to say, maybe the Talmud gives us some additional little insights. We're not using the Talmud to explain anything. There was a scholar, Shana Schick. She argues that there's all kinds of apocryphal material circulating in the Syriac. If that's true, this would seem to be proof against the larger point. She actually claims that Matthew influences the Talmud. Oh, that may be the professor we were talking about earlier. I may have gotten myself all wound up and got out of order in my notes here. And again, I would just say this. There is so much that we don't know for sure. There's so much that we don't know. We know this, but how much do we know? I think it's dangerous to say we know this and therefore we can say all of this. I think it's also dangerous to say we know this, but we can't use it. Somewhere in the middle, that critical back and forth, that peer-reviewed accountability is where the goodness lies. And that's why I love the conversation. She made a comment in her blog post about the Joseph from Obadiah, referencing Talmud, is simply not the Joseph in Matthew. And I am super confused about her point. Unless I missed something, that wasn't the point at all that Elle was making, I don't believe. I may have misunderstood. But the point that Elle was making is there is other conversations happening about Josephs in the world of the Gospels. The Talmud tells us about other stories of Josephs, whether it's Joseph in Torah, whether it's Joseph in Talmud, whether it's Joseph in Matthew. Elle was simply saying there's a conversation between the Josephs. I don't believe at all, unless I totally missed something, that Elle was insinuating the Joseph in Talmud was the same Joseph as the Joseph of Matthew. So I just think there may have been a misunderstanding or a disconnect there. I think Dr. Laura Robinson, if she's seen other people do this, if this is a pet peeve of hers, then she's probably bringing with her assumptions about what we're saying or not saying, and that's okay. I understand that. There's a lot of the things that probably bother her as a pet peeve that we agree with. We're with her on that. We want to think critically about secondary sources. We're probably just using secondary sources a little bit more than she would. We're willing to do that more than she's willing to do that, but not uncritically. So she's probably maybe assuming that we are more uncritical than we are. And that's okay. I would understand. If you've only listened to 10 episodes, you don't know where we're coming from. That's okay. The idea that the Talmud is predicting Jesus. Again, I just don't think that was ever what we were saying. If she was making some of those assumptions, she might have felt like we were saying that, or assuming we were not saying at all that the Talmud was predicting Jesus. That would be weird because the Talmud is, again, in the historical timeline, the Talmud is here and Jesus is here. She says in her blog post, it would be like Thomas Aquinas predicting Muhammad, which is a great illustration. The problem is that's not what we were saying at all. Not at all we were saying. We do believe that when the Talmud references stories that predate Jesus, teachings that predate Jesus, conversations that predate Jesus, we give that secondary source some level of credit. We think that the Talmud is reflecting a Judaism that predates the birth story. So there is a relationship between Judaism, Talmudic Judaism, as the Talmud reflects what was going on, and the Judaism that Jesus is born into. So it's not just two options. We weren't saying that the Talmud is predicting Jesus. We do think the Talmud tells us about a world prior to when Jesus is born. And that's a key distinction, right? Let's see, what else does she say? Norms and patterns of rabbinic Judaism post-date Jesus significantly. Norms and patterns of rabbinic Judaism post-date Jesus significantly. Yes. And it's just more of the same. Do we really think that no conversation is taking place? That none of these things were in place until the destruction of the temple? Like there were no rabbis prior to that? Because we don't, again, minimalist, maximalist. Rabbinic Judaism postdates the Gospels for sure. But that the elements of Rabbinic Judaism aren't at play during the days of Jesus seems crazy to me. Not that she's crazy. That idea, it doesn't feel historically as valid to me. All right, I think basically I've hit most of my notes on the way. I think that's a good place to stop here. Again, I hope we were able to give Dr. Laura Robinson credence. We'll come back in the next video. We'll have an opportunity to circle around and give just some more beautiful thoughts to what she's saying. And I think we're in for some really good conversation. So we'll see you in the next video and wrap this up hopefully well. Talk to you then.